Hi, my name is Lisa Pearson and I am the Trust-wide Suicide Prevention Lead at Northamptonshire Healthcare Foundation Trust. Thanks for tuning in and listening. These are a set of recordings called Let's Talk About Suicide. At the very beginning, I just wanted to give a warning that actually we talk and use the word suicide throughout these recordings. This may not be the right time for you to listen to these, so please think about your well-being. And if it's appropriate, please switch off and come back at a later date. Just make sure that you're feeling okay to listen to the content. Okay, welcome to our recording for Let's Talk About Suicide. And today what we're going to be looking at is myths and language in suicide prevention. And I have a guest with me. Andy, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name's Andy Willis. I'm a lived experience lead within the NHFT. Also, I'm a lived experience got the privilege of making contributions to as an influencer for the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, and also some contributions as a member of the Samaritans Lived Experience Advisory Group.
Oh, thank you, Andy. So everybody who comes on as a guest and on this podcast or recording, what we're asking them is, why do they think it's so important to talk about suicide?
Well, I think first and foremost, the passion comes from a lived experience. It is for me, it's such an important topic. It is a topic in terms of patient safety or in the public health area. It's a matter of life and death, and I've made several attempts to die by suicide. I'm ever grateful that I'm alive and to make contributions like this, but definitely it's a topic where there's an awful lot of stigma, an awful lot of prejudice sometimes, as we're going to be talking about today, some myths. You've got to normalise the conversations. Everybody can play a part in suicide prevention, and one of the key things is having conversations about it to provide that essential support to make that essential difference.
Thank you, Andy. So we're going to talk a bit about language around suicide. Yeah. There's been a lot of changes in suicide prevention, and some of the language that perhaps used now is quite outdated. We're going to see a slide. Andy, could you talk to the slide a little bit about some of the changes?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is part of having that confidence to have those conversations. The conversations are all important, and if people make mistakes, then that's fine. It's most important is to have the conversations. But if you're going to be talking about this topic, it's best, if you like, for culturally and to get in that state, to use the best possible language. That should always be the ambition. So, for example, it should never be presented as a desired outcome, the topic of suicide. And you may have words. Sometimes the language can slip in about something being a successful or somehow unsuccessful, or often what comes sometimes into even clinical notes, completed, and that seems fairly benign, but actually it gives the sense of some sort of accomplishment, the finish of a task. It should just be unemotional, just died by suicide, somebody taking their own life. Another example would be, and this is perhaps one of the most common ones, in the past it's been associated as a sin religiously, historically. I think it's around the early 60s, 63, I think, if you made an attempt on your life, you'd go to prison. So that association of a crime. I know it's something that impacts on families, and that's the phrase committed. It's the one that you hear most. It's the one that ourselves, we always have to be careful that that doesn't slip into that. It's really important. It should just be, again, made neutral. Just somebody has made an attempt to die by suicide, somebody has taken their life, and that removes it. The other thing as well is not to sensationalise it. There's been words like a suicide epidemic, for example, or contagion. No, it's simply increasing rates of suicide or higher rates, and anyway, the appropriate word is a cluster, and that can be as small a number as just 2 people. Another area as well, never glamorise it at all. Some sort of failed bid or failed suicide situation. It's simply a suicide attempt or a non-fatal attempt. And the other one is where it can really be gratuitously used completely out of context. And you may hear the phrasing of politicians doing something and associating political suicide, or in some form of sort of army mission, a suicide mission. No, always avoid refrain from using it out of context. But the most important thing is to have the conversations, not be afraid to make mistakes, but always to push for the most appropriate language that makes it both safe for everyone and appropriate for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's the really important messaging, isn't it? Is that we don't want people not to ask, not to intervene, even if they get it wrong. But it's thinking about how it feels for other people, isn't it? And I suppose what we'd like to see is people role modelling that behaviour. So if you do hear that language, kindly speaking to someone and saying, actually that's changed now, because we don't know what we don't know. So I suppose we're really important that we talk to people about why that's changed, and encourage that and role model that by doing it ourselves. And if people want more information on that, the Samaritans have written excellent media guidance, which you can read, and gives you all of the outcomes, the language in there. And I think it's a really interesting piece that you can have a look at, that's free and accessible. And I think you also become quite, once you know this information, you become quite sensitive to the use of it wrongly. I think, I don't know what you've noticed, but I notice it much more now if it's wrong on the television or in a song. I hear certain songs quite regularly.
And I think the appropriate language removes or diminishes some of the stigma, some of the myths, some of the prejudice, because some of it does come from a historical place of prejudice. The example that we use, that phrase committed, definitely comes from that place, and things have changed, and to continue that change, constantly looking to improve the language and make appropriate use.
So now we're going to talk about myths. So Professor Rory O'Connor is a professor at Glasgow University, and he is the International Suicide Prevention Alliance president, has been for many years, very highly regarded in suicide prevention work. And he has written a book called Into the Darkness, which again, I always feel quite strange suggesting people read, but actually such a positive book around some of his personal experience around suicide and some of the research that he's done. And there was 2 pages in this book around myths that really struck me, and these myths are generated through research, and they're widely accepted internationally, and they can be quite challenging for people to hear. So we always in our training comment on these myths and really just try and give people that information, so encourage them to use.
I understand that he's had a lot of lived experience, that his voice that he's gathered in to inform that book. It's a really good book.
Definitely. So you can see a slide up now, so I'm just going to talk to some of these myths. So asking about suicide put the idea into somebody's head. It's a myth that I've heard throughout my career in suicide prevention, and probably before, is people are really worried, especially family and friends, about talking to people. Actually, research says that's not the case. If people are thinking about suicide, the thought's already there. And actually what people report is it's a relief to talk to someone. They see that as a caring intervention, that you actually care and love them and want to make sure they're okay. So actually it's a myth. Thinking about suicide is rare. It's very common to have suicidal thoughts. I think sometimes trying to break down some of the stigma is around this isn't every person problem. Anybody can have a suicidal thought at any time in their life. And we know statistically 1 in 15 people will attempt to take their life in their lifetime. So this isn't a few people, this is lots of people that struggle with this.
This is 1 in 5 have a suicidal thought of some type in their life. So it's very common.
Suicidal people want to die. We talk a lot around that emotional distress that you experience at that point, and actually when you talk to people, particularly after they've come out of crisis, they didn't want to die. We are creatures that problem solve, and what we do is we will problem solve until we get to a solution, and for some people the only solution they can see is to take their life. So actually having those conversations with people and really recognising that they're in distress and perhaps challenging the thought that they want to die is really important. So, and I think we just need to think about that as being a myth and have those conversations. If someone becomes suicidal, they'll always remain suicidal. We know that's not the case. There's so many people. Do you want to add to that one?
I think the one, both from my own lived experience and also talking with others, that first one, any fear that somehow you're, by talking about the topic of suicide, is going to, some of those ideas are going to spring into people's heads. It's not the case. Those thoughts are either there, and actually by talking about suicide, it both validates those thoughts, and when it, I always recognise it as care. It's really important as well, if there's any hesitation, to think, well, if they've got suicidal thoughts, they somehow trigger that person into an area of planning. Not the case.
Those who talk about suicide are not at risk is something that we also talk about in our training, but also it's really important to say that it wasn't that long ago that in clinical practice, if you're working in mental health, you were told that. And actually that's not the case, is that if people are talking about it, we still need to take their expression seriously, we still need to meet them with a compassionate language and that listening ear. So and so it's always important that we think about that actually if people are verbalising, we still should be taking it seriously. Suicide comes without warning is one that people find quite challenging, especially if you've been bereaved by suicide. What Professor O'Connor is talking about is hindsight. So what he's saying is when you go back and you look, there are verbal and behavioural signs and warning signs that you can see. You might not have seen them at the time, so it's not for anybody to take that concern and worrying and guilt that they might be able to do something differently. Actually, what he's saying is, when we look back, we can see that there are. Suicide is inherited. I know mental health has lots of conversations about genetics. We don't know. We don't think there is any evidence to say that it is inherited, but we do know that you're more likely to take your life if you have a family or a friend who has taken their own life too. And statistically you are, but we don't know necessarily what that statistic is about. And suicide behaviour is attention seeking, and we see this a lot, and it's something we really wanted to challenge, is that actually some people will consistently come and present really struggling, and actually we need to take all attempts seriously, and that can be quite difficult if you're working with a family member, or you've got a friend who is consistently talking about suicide, is that it's still to take it seriously, it's still to take that compassionate approach, even though that can be really difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
So thinking about our myths and thinking about the word committed and actually why that has changed in the UK not being a crime or seen as a crime. We still know from the International Suicide Prevention Alliance that 20 countries across the world still class a suicide attempt as a crime punishable by law. We're thinking about stigma a lot in this recording, and actually how that impacts on us. How would you say stigma or discrimination has impacted on you, or what are your views on it?
I think, if I'm talking sort of generally, in mental health, there has been progress around people are more likely to talk about anxiety and depression, but there is still, nevertheless, in mental health generally, still a lot of barriers, still a lot of stigma in this. If we're looking at a topic, for me, it's all about reducing those barriers, whether it's using appropriate language, normalising it, removing some of the myths. It's about access to support, and suicide, there's no doubt, in the community, wherever it is, there are still big barriers, and that comes down to stigma, it comes down to lack of knowledge sometimes. The topic of self-harm arguably is even more stigmatised, but either way, it has to be constantly teased at and normalised, and by removing those myths, by using the right language, most importantly, removing the prejudice and the discrimination, because what that prejudice and discrimination, those sort of barriers, stops people talking.
And it's challenging that, isn't it? And I think there's a lot around individuals, like shame that's attached to it, and feeling that people have failed. And I suppose it's that normalising, again, just the amount of people who struggle with this.
Sometimes you don't articulate because somehow you feel, if it's the first thoughts you're having, you could be feeling like sort of weakness, that somehow you can get through, and that shame and that guilt, why am I having these thoughts? It's a whole melee of different negative emotions, damaging self-emotions, if you like, associated with being in that place. And some of that does come from the very barriers we've been talking about. It's about reaching out for help.
Definitely, and trying to let people know that that's okay, and that we're going to do a recording on hope and interruption, that actually there is hope and things can change for you. I also think we ought to say about how scary it can be if you're experiencing those sorts of thoughts, especially if you've never had them before.
If you've got no insight into any emotional intensity and problems, or certainly no insight if there is a layer of severe mental illness coming on, that is a terrifying place to be. You've got nothing to counter it with. And if those thoughts, and if their thoughts are coming for the first time, there are going to be certain presentations of thoughts. If you've got some insight, you can actually counter quite a lot while you're reaching out for help. But without that, you're even doubly vulnerable. And it's all part of it.
So our messaging really is about how important it is to not only reach out to others and ask the question, which we talk a lot about in these recordings, but also think about your own well-being and ask for help. And preventative health is key for that, isn't it?
I think at any stage of distress or mental ill health, the quicker you talk, the quicker you seek support, the more likely to prevent yourself getting into a place where some of these thoughts may happen. But I think it's worth referencing that some of the research is showing that it's not exclusive at all to severe mental illness, which we may have referenced today, but equally, those thoughts that are very common, and 1 in 5, they're triggered often by moderate depression. Is awful. You can be having these thoughts, and that's where you need, as an individual, to get to your GP, share it with your family, or be asking that question of others. It just breaks down some of these barriers to prejudice.
At the end of all of the recordings, we're asking people to take a pledge. So for World Suicide Prevention Day 2024, the theme is Change the Narrative. And we really want to tackle the stigma and make more conversations around suicide. So please think about that going forward. And if you could take these conversations and the things that you've learned today and talk to your colleagues and your friends and family about it, this would really work towards the theme of changing the narrative. If you're interested in more training around suicide prevention, the Zero Suicide Alliance have free 20-minute training where you're able to take that and learn more about talking to people about suicide. You're able to access this online on zerosuicidealliance.com/training, and you're able to access different modules depending on your interest. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the recording. If you've been impacted by anything that you've heard, please reach out for help. There are people you can talk to. In Northamptonshire, we have a 24-hour mental health that you can ring on 0800 448 0828. Alternatively, you can ring 111 and press 2 for the mental health option. If you want to talk to somebody, you're able to speak to the Samaritans on a 24-hour basis, and their number is 116 123. If you don't want to speak to someone on the phone and prefer to text somebody, you're able to use the National Shout service, and that number is text 85258. In Northamptonshire, we have a bereavement support service for anyone who's bereaved by suicide called Kelly's Heroes, and you're able to contact them if you want to talk to somebody about your bereavement and you feel you've been impacted on 0800 0025 400. There are also extensive information online that you're able to look up and email them. You're also able to contact survivors of bereavement by suicide, which is a peer support group. You're able to ring them and find out where their nearest group is in Northamptonshire, where you can meet fellow people that have had the same experience of you and get some peer support. Also, we would encourage you to use your social networks and your friends and families and colleagues. It's really important that you may not need to talk to a professional, but you are able to talk to them about how you're feeling and the impact this recording has had on you.